first thing I want to look at is I want to kind of look at y'all's picture of a teacher. So here we have a teacher. This looks like it could be like an ornament. Do y'all know, like sometimes you see those ornaments with the faces? I don't know. So we got a teacher teaching with a little rug, the wheels on the bus. Like it? Oh. We'll cover up the name. Well, and let's just look. We'll go ahead and look at both at the same time. So we've got teacher and we've got our farmer here.
I feel like I have to explain that.
Okay, explain.
Okay, so I work at the co-op in the summer, and I base it off of Carrie Peterson, who comes in on the grain truck, and she basically just works the whole family operation. So I try to make it look like a grain truck. It didn't work out very well.
I like it.
It looks fun. Thank you.
I like it. So now we have another teacher and farmer. Do y'all think that's a cow?
I mean, it's saying moon, so I would hope so.
It kind of looks like a goat and a cat had a baby.
Yeah. A goat and a cat had a baby, and out came a cow. Who knew?
Its head is so round.
That's okay. So we got our farmer and our teacher there. All right, farmer and teacher here. Put up names. Is that a horse? Yeah.
Better than mine.
Okay. I like this one. What are you saying about the farmer? A little more stout of a human? Teacher. Oh, and I like little kiddos. Farmer, out in the field. Okay. Teacher and farmer. Teacher here saying, let's get you ready for the world. Farmer's like, hi,
Okay.
cow. I would like to compare this cow to the other cow.
Why did we set the spots?
I feel like they're pretty similar. Pretty good. Okay. Students, you are loved.
You are loved.
I like that. And then we got our farmer with co-op hat and overalls on.
Pitchfork.
They work a lot, okay? It's been used.
Like a aerodynamic, or never mind, I don't know.
Yes.
Ergonomic.
Ergonomic pitchfork, yeah. And then let's see what we've got here. Teacher and the farmer. Pretty similar. Out in the field. And teacher and a farmer. Oh, we have it could be anybody. This one's got a little bit of straw chewing on. Any similarities or things you notice between the pictures about the teacher?
A lot of them are like the lower level teachers, like the ideal like chalkboard in the back.
Mm-hmm. It is funny, since several of y'all are ag ed, we still have that notion of standing in front of a chalkboard teaching, right? And yet we're kind of taught maybe that's not always the most effective way of teaching. What else, though, are some similarities between some of these teachers?
Female.
For the most part, female. Yeah. So, indicative by length of hair, things like that. Do you think maybe that plays into a little bit to the grade level that's drawn about, too? Could be. We do have some that we had one male teacher specifically I saw in here, or assumed male, right? Who drew that teacher?
I did.
Why did you draw the teacher that way?
I thought my ag teacher.
Your ag teacher. Yeah.
And a lot of the teachers I look up to are male.
Okay. What about our farmers? What are some similarities we noticed about our farmers? A little more stout. I saw a lot of hats. Oh, pitchforks?
Lots of pitchforks.
Lots of
American
pitchforks.
Gothic up in here.
Yeah, we're going very much back to nostalgia, right? A couple hats were drawn, right? Whether it's a cowboy hat or just a ball cap. Outside. I like the shawl. And then you can maybe even replace that with maybe chewing tobacco, right? Like, what do you feel like your drawings kind of bring out about some stereotypes about different jobs and things people do? Do we have stereotypes about who does what? Yeah. You know, we talked about it a little bit with culture, about this idea of having kind of implicit bias. So this idea, it's not bad. We all have it, right? Like we just, based on our life experiences, we've kind of developed a bias or a certain way we think about things. The only time implicit bias becomes harmful is when we don't just talk about what those things are, and we kind of let them rule decisions and opinions that we make without realizing they're influencing what we're doing. I want to watch this short clip, and it's where I got the idea for this activity, to kind of introduce what we're going to chat about today in class.
Can you show us your drawing? Can you hold it up? Can you tell us what you drew?
I drew a farmer. A farmer would look like
That painting of a guy with a pitchfork sitting next to his wife.
he's wearing a gray shirt and overalls. He would like to feed animals every day.
I drew a truck driver. Most truck drivers, I think they'll wear the same thing.
He probably has a odd shirt and jeans. Sometimes he just wears regular clothes. I drew a chef. He's wearing a black suit and a black hat. He would have utensils like pans and pots.
I drew a nutrition scientist. He's wearing a lab coat with jeans and red shoes.
He is holding a big majiggy. He's wearing a ambulex. His voice is huge. He.
So you picked your scientist to be a girl. Why did you pick it as a girl?
I guess that could be me. Every time I thought of scientists, I thought of girls. Boys are not the only one who could be scientists. There's a lot of boy farmers and there's a lot of girl farmers. Girls are just as capable of doing anything as boys can. Girls could do anything because they're strong.
So that was an ad that was put out by Tyson about 2 years ago. What are y'all's thoughts about watching the ad?
I like it.
Why?
Lots that I like pro, like female.
What stands out to you about the ad? Like, what was maybe one of the points they were trying to drive home?
Like, just because they're stereotyped in that position, like men are stereotyped to be farmers, doesn't mean that a woman can't be a farmer.
Right.
Or
So trying
vice
to,
versa for a teacher or something.
yeah, trying to break that mold of that stereotype. What else? There's a part in it where they kind of start speeding up what the kids are saying. And when they're talking about these different occupations, they keep saying he. Did y'all pick up on that? Like they sped it? Why do you think they highlighted that in the ad? What is that telling us? They're trying to demonstrate to us. Does language matter? How so?
I think a lot of kids growing up, they always think just it's males, and you can tell that that one girl was just raised in a household with her, because like, you can be anything you want to be. And I feel like not everyone gets that opportunity, so it is mostly he's in that position or she's in that position.
Yeah. If you were to start talking about someone as a nurse, what pronoun might you start using?
Girl.
She. Okay. When we talk about teachers, I know we're kind of unique being in ag ed because we do tend to have a lot of male teachers in our particular profession, and so this isn't always the case. That's why I'm not surprised that, you know, a male was drawn as a teacher, because you may have had, how many of y'all had a male ag teacher? How many of y'all had a female ag teacher?
And both.
Had both. Same. Right? But for the most part, for most of the population, what do you think people would say when they start talking about teaching? Or she? Are there any other occupations y'all can think of where there tends to be a stereotype as to who or what is mostly in that profession?
Truck driver.
Truck drivers. So they highlight that. What's probably the stereotype? Men, yeah. What else?
Cosmetology.
Cosmetology. It's got to be a she, right? Yeah. What else?
Firefighters.
Huh?
Firefighters.
Firefighters. Okay. So this isn't just an ag thing. It's kind of all occupations, you know, that we kind of get at. And I think what Tyson did with this ad wasn't just, you know, helping to kind of like bring to light this thing that, you know, there's just as many places in agriculture for women as there are men. To me, they're really honing on the importance of language and what we say and realizing whether that's inclusive or not. And how just the simple fact of either saying for a certain job, if you're always saying he, you may be telling little girls that this might not be an area for them to go into. Or if you're always saying she, when talking about nursing, maybe men grow up thinking that nursing isn't a field for them to go into, right? And so how can we, you know, what are some things we can do to be more inclusive in our language in that way?
It's kind of funny you mentioned this. Last night I was taking the OSAT, which a lot of us know what that is. It's a teacher exam. And I was to the writing portion, and it was talking about helping a student with their SAE. And I just noticed myself naturally saying, I will help this student with his SAE by blah, blah, blah. He will, did it. And I was like, wait a minute. So I edited it. But it was weird that.
Can't you just say they?
Yeah.
That's weird because I said she a lot.
Really?
Really?
Yeah.
Who said they? Said they?
I trained myself to say they.
I had to go back
Yeah.
and
I fix it to
change it to them and that aspect because
Yeah.
you don't worry about it.
I've experienced kind of like, I don't know, people making judgments just because I'm female. So now it's like I'm more hyper aware of the fact that I should be saying they.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when I don't know.
Right, especially when you don't know. And so, yeah, it's just more inclusive language. And then, you know, I would say 10 years ago, you'd have people that would yell at you and say, that's not grammatically correct. It is now. And it's part of it. Or even just simply doing he/she, right? But it's just easier to say they, right? So today we're talking about gender and leadership and understanding from research some of the things that we know about how gender, as its own little like bit of our identity as a person, how that affects effective leadership, perceptions of leadership. And I think what y'all are going to find as we go through there is there's going to be some stuff that's probably not surprising to you, right? But what you may also find is that maybe the research, some of the things that we assume happen in organizations based off of gender differences, maybe isn't quite as true when we actually look at the data on it. So I think y'all are going to find it pretty interesting. First off, why does this always seem to be a hard conversation to have? Talking about gender and leadership as a group. In class today, we're a mixed group of different genders. Why does this always seem to just be, let's just be honest? Why is
We're
it hard?
scared to offend some people and then step on other people's toes. Because obviously primarily we're talking about girl, boy, but there's also our newer pronouns and stuff that we're not all super comfortable with if that's not your lifestyle. So it's just we don't want to offend each other and be judged by each other, essentially.
It's just a hard conversation that you're afraid might be offensive. And honestly, sometimes those conversations are only offensive when you're not approaching the conversation with the attitude of wanting to learn about it. You mentioned, kind of not being comfortable with different pronouns, or even just the concept of, hold on, there's more than two genders, or things like that. We all come to the table with different experiences, different beliefs that are driving our attitudes towards these things. And what happens when we start talking about beliefs and values and attitudes? Is it comfortable or easy? What do y'all think?
I think it depends who you're with.
Yeah. If you're around a group of people that share all of the same things, it can be an easy, comfortable conversation. But the more diverse the group is, the harder the conversations can be. And oftentimes when we're in roles of leadership, we are usually in situations with diverse groups of people. And so it can be difficult. What are some of y'all's initial thoughts about gender and leadership? Do you think this should even be a topic that's talked about in a leadership theory class? Do you think there's differences in how different genders lead? Have you experienced it? Are there stereotypes? Again, just what are some of y'all's initial thoughts?
I don't know. I think we've come a long way from when I was first in high school and I was thinking of a female ag teacher. I thought that was weird until I actually saw it, just because I'd never been around it. I think there definitely is some biases still to this day. Not necessarily on purpose, but just back there. I know I still am I don't know.
Let's talk about our profession. So ag ed, communications, and leadership. Are there any stereotypes or biases that y'all think might exist related to gender in our professions?
Be a mom.
AgCom, be a mom. What's another one? Ag ed, stay in bed. Y'all heard that one? I don't know what the one is for ag lead. Nobody will tell me.
There's not one.
There's not. Bobby, you're AgCom, right? Have you experienced any gender stereotypes as an AgCom student?
Yeah.
How so?
I live in a house with 95 guys that are all ag majors, so they all go to ag com.
Isn't that what girls do if they want to be an ag, right? Mm-hmm. I have several male friends who, in ag communications, they're the minority, right? The situation's often flipped for them. What are some other stereotypes or biases we see? I'll tell you one that my grandmother said to me when I was getting certified to teach ag. And y'all can either say you've heard it or not, but I'm going to just say it, what my Nana said to me. She goes, I think it's great you want to be an ag teacher, but please don't stop wearing makeup and don't just wear your hair in a ponytail all the time. What was being implied there? I love my Nana. I love her. But I know what she was trying to say, right? Mm-hmm. What else? This is our time to just be honest and get real.
I think with even in ag ed that most times people think of a male teacher as the mechanics portion of the ag ed.
Mm-hmm. Everybody, back row, you just lit up the back row. Explain.
Tiny soapbox.
Yes, let's go.
This semester, I have been teaching nothing but.
And it's been really good.
Thank you, Ashley.
And I've been teaching horticulture.
I've been teaching nothing but ag mechanics in 4103. And after I taught my first lesson to my peers, one of them looked at me and he was like, "No offense, I didn't think you were going to know as much as you do." And I did take offense to it, obviously.
Anytime someone starts out with no offense, you know something's coming that's about to be offensive, just FYI.
I wanted to be like, yeah, I do know more than you probably thought I knew because I'm not an imbecile and I'm fully competent and capable of being a decent ag teacher. But also not to keep going, but I've also experienced people being like, how are you supposed to be a mom or have a family if you're an ag teacher? I get that all the time. And it's very demeaning.
Yeah. It's I know we're past this, but we're not in some sense. It's I'm not just supposed to have babies. That is not my sole purpose. But also, I have been facing some issues. I love my job at the hog barn. It's great. Love shoveling pig crap around. It's awesome. Who wouldn't want to do that? But he doesn't. I recently just got past I can now drive the trailer, and it's not a big deal that I can drive and back up the trailer. And he trusts me that I can do it all the way to Edmond and back. I don't know. It's just I'm a grown woman. I've done this a couple times.
I can tell you several, more than I can count, more than one hand. When I came back to get my PhD, the number of people that told me not to forget I was a mom. Again, yeah. Not to forget that my most important job was being a mom. And I asked my husband during that same time when we were making the move out here, if anybody made the comment to him about moving to Oklahoma and if there was anything said about his job and his job decisions, and not a thing was said to him about not forgetting he was a dad or being a dad. And that hurts. It's hard not to say it hurts when things like that are said.
It's kind of funny, so big time horse girl, I know. But this past weekend I've been at the World.
Or big time horse person.
There we go. Well,
Okay.
That's the thing is, all the people, honestly, the majority of people that show horses are females, but the majority of horse trainers, the big name whatevers, are male. And I don't understand how that's a thing. That's my other gender bias.
Save that thought. That's a good thought. We'll talk about some of that. You mentioned you're teaching horticulture.
Yes.
Why do you feel like that's been maybe a break of gender stereotypes?
Okay, so what she was going to bring up, I did not say this, she's trying to say I did, but
I
it's
promise
been-
you said it and I can give you the whole scenario.
No, it was our other friend, she's getting me confused. Anyway, it's always been a stereotype that men teach the mechanics and female ag teachers, if they're together, tend to take over the leadership and plant soil horticulture.
Leadership, horticulture, floral arrangement. Oh, yeah, I got it. Mm-hmm.
So it's,
Yeah.
I don't know, when I started teaching that, I just wanted to get out of my comfort zone, something I wasn't familiar with, so.
Good for you. Good for you.
But that's also, that's kind of weird too, because I know an ag teacher that they do, he's a male obviously, but they do weddings and stuff, floral arrangements, and they're big horticulture, basically the floral aspect of it.
I think it's
people
just-
actually hire them to do weddings and stuff.
I think it's just really fascinating. We want to think a lot of times that these gender stereotypes are truth. And what I mean by that is that this is just how things have always been. That this is how men and women were designed, and these are the types of things or talents that they've been given, and so that's why there's certain jobs that they have. But think back to it. If in the 1950s, if less than 20% of women were in the workforce, who was running the bakery? Who was running the flower shop in town? Think about it. What are some of those other, who were the teachers? Right? Men. How did we get to this spot where we have such stereotypes and the roles and things that different genders do.
Like a lot of men go into like manual labor, hard labor jobs, and women don't. I mean, some do, but for the most part, they don't.
Actually, here, I'm just gonna, other side of this. So my little brother, God bless him, this summer, he just graduated his freshman year. He worked for a dirt moving company, Edmond, and his boss and his only coworker were both females. And he was the only dude on the team. So just other side of that, yeah, it's dominated by guys, but just the other side of it.
I just look at it mostly at the aspect of where I'm from. Like, we have 2 or 3 trailer companies that build trailers around us. We have J&I Manufacturing, and we have Oklahoma Steel and Iron, we have Mid-America Steel and Iron. 90% of that is male. And so in our town, for the aspect of it, most of the office jobs and all that stuff are mainly dominated by women, but also in the banks and stuff, there are men. In my mom's office, there are men. In the post office, there are men. But if you look at it, the ratio to female to men on those big places out there are going to be mainly dominated.
I think another big reason that we have like such this gender identity with roles, I also think it's because of like what's going on in the world. Like during World War II in Vietnam, like who was going off to war, like who's in the draft. So when people are called off to war, you don't have a choice of what needs to start being taken over. So I feel like males went to the hard labor in the machinery because it's a lot of heavy lifting, and females were associated to going, okay, now I have to run this floral shop, or I need to now become a teacher because they're not there anymore.
Yes, that is when we saw the biggest shift happen. World War II was the biggest part of it, because that is really when women started entering the workforce. And honestly, at that time, it wasn't even so much because they wanted to. The government was saying, we need people to fill these jobs or else our economy is going to crash while we send everyone overseas for war, right? And, we do hear a lot about like Rosie the Riveter, right? Going in, working mechanics, things like that. But then when the men came back, women had this taste of being in the workforce and what it meant for them to earn their own money, to feel, a sense of responsibility and contribution to the home beyond just being a homemaker. And yet they were kind of taken out of some of those harder labor jobs and said, well, now we're going to put you back in the office or what have you. And our economy had seen the benefit of having women work. I think it's really hard for us to acknowledge where our country's at today without acknowledging the role it was of having women enter the workforce. Like I said, before the 1950s, less than 20% of women worked. Today, it's around 80% of women are in the workforce. We would have we've seen it with COVID, with the amount of women, and that's a whole other complex thing we won't get into today at all, but the amount of women that have had to put their careers on hold to stay home with kids because of COVID, that has had a significant economic impact that a lot of people aren't talking about perhaps as much as other things. But all that to say, it is interesting that we kind of saw this shift from not as many women working to them being in the workforce. But before industrialization, did women work? Were women homemakers? What would history tell us about that? What have you maybe learned about how the family life was, say in the 17 and 1800s? Did women just stay home and cook all the time?
Yep. No.
Well, they had like chores at home and stuff too. Like they were farming as well, or they were like doing other work, just not just sitting in their houses cleaning and cooking all day.
Right. We were a highly agrarian society. Most people lived on farms. Both spouses were working from home on their farms. It was shared labor, shared duties. So it really wasn't until the industrialization period that we really saw the shift away. Not as many people needed to be living on farms. Not as many people were living on farms. Men were getting jobs and women were staying home. Cost of living wasn't as high. You didn't need, 2 incomes. There's a lot of things contributing. So it's important for us to start the conversation keeping that in mind, that again, kind of the stereotypes, gender roles haven't always been that way. And that brings to a good point about this idea of gender roles, gender stereotypes being culturally constructed. What do y'all think I mean by that? Why are gender roles and stereotypes culturally constructed?
I always think of, like, I guess the Disney princess movies. I don't know if that's really where this is going, but it's always like waiting on the man to rescue them until, like, you know, our newer ones that have come out, like Moana and whatever. I don't know, that's an example, I guess.
Yeah. You know, one thing I like to ask myself, and I ask this when I'm dealing with things with my own faith, when I'm dealing it with, like, again, is this a truth or not, is that if it's true for me here, is it also true if I were to live in Malawi? Would it be true for me if I lived in Korea? And if it's not, then it's probably giving me a good hint that something might be culturally constructed and not really be a truth, okay? And so, you know, in the United States, there tends to be, again, kind of whether we say we've moved past it or not, there's this thing of like, well, women's main role is at home or to focus on their family, then their career. How do you think that might go over with somebody who lives in a developing country? What do gender roles look like in developing countries oftentimes? Who's running the economy? Who's working the most? Doing the most labor? Women. So like when we go to do agricultural development in developing countries, the focus is usually on working with women because they're the ones doing the manual labor on the farms. They're the ones running the farms. Oftentimes husbands are the ones at home. Isn't that interesting? And so we just have to realize that maybe some of the biases, those implicit biases that we come to with these conversations, again, we have them, but oftentimes they're culturally constructed. They're just not things that are truths everywhere. And so some of this research into gender and leadership comes from that, trying to figure out like what things are culturally constructed and what things actually have weight to them, okay? So here I have some, really the main questions that we ask. When we talk about gender and leadership, we don't get into a lot of the nitty-gritty as far as pay equity or who should be able to do what kinds of jobs. We're looking at when people are in leadership positions, is there truly a difference between a man who's a leader and a woman who's a leader? What are some characteristics of women leaders that are stereotypical? What do we say? What do we expect from women leaders? And when they don't fulfill that role, we kind of get frustrated.
Compassionate.
We expect women leaders to be compassionate. What else? Empathetic, right? So any of y'all ever worked for a woman, or maybe you know a woman who just really, they're more task oriented. Like they're not going to be the most empathetic person, right? It kind of messes with our preconceived notions of what a woman leader should be. What are some stereotypes of men leaders? Assertive. What else? Confident. And almost an abundance of it, right? What else? Anything else that we typically expect from male leaders? Do we usually expect male leaders, and like when I say assertive, to kind of have a plan, to be, I don't want to use the word dominant, but in control, kind of really leading efforts, a little bit more authoritarian, right? That's what this research question is getting at, is that like, okay, we kind of know what these stereotypes are, but when we look in the workplace, when we look in organizations, is that actually how these different genders lead? And how does that affect followers' perceptions of them? So let's just be honest. We say that, a characteristic of male leadership is assertiveness. How are women perceived when they're assertive? Pushy. So we might label a male leader assertive and a woman leader pushy. If we have a woman leader who is empathetic, we're like, yeah, she understands. She's really understanding with the people she works with. But if we have a male leader that's really empathetic, what do we call him? A wuss. I've heard male leaders called that. They're soft. I won't say the really derogatory thing, but you'll say they have no, you fill in the blank. Okay? I know. We come from similar backgrounds. I know things that are said, right? So we've got to understand, is this really true? And so then with that, we want to look at the question of, are men more effective leaders than women? There was a lot of push with the idea of the great man theory, that there are just characteristics. There are God-given characteristics that men have that just make them better leaders. Is that really true in business and organizational settings? And then we do look at this idea of underrepresentation. So Ashley, you brought up the point that, in horse showing, a lot of the people who show are women, but then the judges tend to be men. Why is there this disconnect in what's happening? And so we're going to, again, this is all kind of just high level things that research has shown with us that we're going to go through. So I want to know, fact or myth? With women earning more than 50% of the degrees in higher education now, women now also represent a majority of leadership in the workforce. Is that a fact or a myth? How many of y'all say fact? That if more than 50% of people graduating are women, then you would assume 50% of leadership positions are held by women too. Anyone fact? How many say myth? It's a myth. So we have this idea, y'all may have heard of the term before called the glass ceiling. I saw a thing going around on Facebook right after elections were announced, and it said, put your shoes on, lady. There's shattered glass all on the floor. And it's referring to this analogy of the glass ceiling. And so used to what we would say is that women, they can climb the same ladder as men, but there's going to be this barrier that's hard to see, that just for some reason they can't seem to get past it. That was probably the notion until the mid-90s. But then two researchers, AGLE and Carly, they wrote a really great book about women leadership. It's called The Leadership Labyrinth. And what they have found now is that because we have become, at least in our culture, a little bit more gender egalitarian, women do have more of the same opportunities as men in organizations. But for some reason, it's not so much that there's this glass ceiling that's preventing them from getting there, because we can think of a lot of examples of women in high leadership positions. But it takes them a little bit, not just a little bit, a lot more effort and maybe some more hoops that they have to jump through to get there. And so we call it now the leadership labyrinth. It's the fact that it just appears, based on research, that there's just more things that women have to go through in order to achieve those certain positions or things. What are some of those particular, you think about a labyrinth, you're kind of going around and then you hit a dead end and you have to turn around and try something again. What may be some of those dead ends that may affect women in the workplace progressing on that perhaps don't affect other genders? Having kids, how so?
I mean, a lot of companies, when you're going through, I know it's not so much this way like in small town Oklahoma, but in bigger places, if you ask are you planning to have children, and you say yes, you have a lower chance of getting the job.
Yes, which there are laws against that, but it still happens. unfortunately. Just so y'all know, and this is for men and women, if you are ever asked about your personal life in a job interview, that is a violation of HR laws. Because that's providing information that could especially because of implicit bias and discrimination, cause people to discriminate against you unintentionally. And the reason I say that is I have a friend whose husband did not get a job that he had been like homed for. Like this was supposed to be his next thing. But because they asked about his wife and her next job move, and they didn't really like the answer given, he didn't get it. That's discrimination. You don't make job hiring decisions based off of that. So just know that y'all have that right to be like, you know, I'm here for professional reasons, and I'd prefer not to discuss my personal life. You know, they don't need to know whether you're single or married or have kids or not have kids. Okay, it's up to you to disclose that information. But yeah, having kids is a huge one of those, and I will be the first to tell you, I have a very supportive husband. Sometimes people will say, well, do you approach parenting 50-50? And I said, I sometimes feel like we approach it 70-30 and he's the 70%. But that's how our particular marriage has worked. But even at the same time, him and I talk about, he often is the one that points these things out to me because I just assume that this is how things should be. We realized, I have a friend that graduated the same time as me, because in our country, maternity and paternity leave isn't offered to everyone. When families have children, you know, men oftentimes aren't given time off of work. And it's a significant portion of time that it can affect women and affect their time in the office and whether they're able to progress. And so, you know, I don't ever, as of right now, ever dream of being an administrator. But say that was something I was wanting to work towards. Well, you have certain requirements you have to meet. You have to be a tenured faculty member, all this stuff. Well, if I have the child I'm about to have now, maybe we have another one down the road, that could potentially put me back 2 or 3 years behind someone who graduated at the same time as me to being able to apply for those positions. So if in 6 years from now there comes an administrative position opening, technically we should both be qualified because we've both been in the profession 6 years. But I've had to add 2 more years on my time to get tenure because I was out for a significant amount of time having a child, whereas this other person hasn't. So who's going to be qualified at the time in 6 years to apply for that position? My male friend. And we've talked about this, and we're just like, oh, just something about this doesn't seem right. Really, the more equal thing would be to say it's just as important for men to be home and giving men that time to be home, right? Anyways, that would be one of those roadblocks or kind of dead ends. Any other dead ends that y'all could think of that might impact women differently in the workplace? Beyond just biologically having children. Who takes on most caretaking needs in families, whether it's for elderly parents or, again, those are the kinds of dead ends we're thinking about that we still tend to kind of have these gender stereotypes with on those things. Okay, so it's interesting to note that more women are today earning higher degrees. They make up nearly half of the workforce. But yet when we look in our corporations, when we look in our organizations, when we look at our political structure, very much underrepresented. So only 5.4% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. And then when we look at boards, so if we say, well, maybe it's not all about just like the top position CEO, maybe leadership is serving on boards, still only 20% of board seats are often filled by women. Okay. We know that women make up 50% of our population, and yet the numbers are higher based on the 2018 election, and they haven't come out with the full numbers for 2020 since there's still some things being contested. But we saw a little bit of an increase there, but it's still only a fifth of our representation of our population. So just some interesting kind of facts to have there. When we look at the labyrinth, what we need to know is kind of, again, these roadblocks. We have this human capital, which is like, are there any things happening from a human capital standpoint that are making it a little bit harder for women to get these positions? And so we have education, work experience, developmental opportunities, work-home conflict. You know, those are things we've talked about. But then we have the prejudice, so those stereotypes and biases that happen in the workplace. And then we have gender differences. What's considered effective or not based on what your gender is. Who gets promoted? You know, we know from a ton of research on diversity, whether it is ethnic diversity, gender diversity, when it comes to hiring decisions in businesses and promotion decisions, we tend to promote and hire people who are like us. Okay? Again, it's kind of just our implicit bias. You know, you feel you have an interview with someone and you're like, man, we just really hit it off. What are reasons you probably hit it off? Did you find something in common with each other? You remind each other. So, you know, I remember one of the reasons I chose to go to Texas A&M for my master's was because the professor I talked to went to Auburn. And I was like, we have so much in common. Did we really have that much in common? No. But it felt like it, right? And so he hired me on because he's like, she came from Auburn, you know? We just do over time. And so unless we're intentionally thinking about making diverse hiring and promotion decisions, we're going to fall into that rut of just hiring and promoting people like us. And this happens a lot with gender. And that's why there is quite a bit of focus in research of like, what's happening when women are in these leadership positions? Does that same thing happen? It's also why representation is important, is because that's probably the best way to start developing diversity and inclusion in organizations. Fact or myth? There is a leadership gap because women self-select to take themselves out of leadership tracks by choosing the mommy track positions that don't funnel into leadership positions. What do y'all think? So is the reason why we don't see as many women horse judgers because women just don't choose to do that? Or is it because women are, you know, what do y'all think? Fact or myth? How many say fact? How many say myth? So it's actually a myth, but that doesn't, what I will add to that though is that doesn't disregard people's personal stories. I know many women who have said, I know with my current situation and how things are in the culture of my organization, I'm never going to be able to be promoted because I have outside circumstances. And so I've just had to choose not to do that. They kind of identify that the organization's not really working to make their processes more inclusive. So some women will say that they feel like this has happened to them. But from a research standpoint, what we have usually found is this isn't the case. Usually if people have taken themselves out of kind of the line of leadership, it's usually been their personal intentional decision to do that. Okay? But there are definitely structural things in place that make it sometimes harder, and this does tend to be a conversation that women have more than men do when it looks at kind of what they're deciding to do with their career path. Fact or myth? Women lead more democratically and are just as task-oriented as men in organizational studies. How many say fact? How many say myth? This is a fact. So research has shown us that when we look at that scale of kind of democratic versus autocratic leadership, overall women do tend to lead more democratically. Men tend to lead more autocratically. Be careful though of making that a stereotype, because anytime we do research, we always have outliers, right? So we've got to be mindful of that. But research would say as a whole, when we look at organizations, women do tend to be more collaborative. They do tend to bring in more voices, whereas men do have a tendency to just kind of make decisions for an organization. But on the flip side of that, when we ask followers or subordinates about kind of the task versus relationship orientation of women, y'all kind of mentioned it earlier. We expect women to be more empathetic. We expect men to perhaps be more assertive. What we have really found is that women leaderships in business settings are just as task-oriented as men in organizational studies. The first time I heard the statistic, it made me feel better about myself because I tend to be more task-oriented, and I always felt like people saw that as a negative thing because I was supposed to be, I just did. I felt like I was supposed to be super relational all the time. But it was nice to see kind of research back up that, maybe that isn't a gender stereotype. Any of y'all feel like you've experienced that yourselves? Or maybe the flip side, you're supposed to be task-oriented, but you're actually more relational? Okay. A lot of men experience that. I had probably the most relational boss I ever had at Auburn, and it was a male. And people would always say, like, man, Dr. Patterson's great, but he wants to sit and chit-chat about family a lot. And I'm like, I think it's great. Like, it was just so refreshing. But he, sometimes got a lot of flack because people didn't think that was how his demeanor should be as a male leader for a college. Okay, fact or myth? If a woman acts too manly at work, she's likely to be perceived as a less effective leader. What would research say? Fact or myth? How many of y'all say fact? Who says myth? Nobody's raising their hand, so I don't know. What do y'all think?
I think it's fact.
It's a fact. Research has shown that. So we kind of call those the double-edged swords, right? And it all goes back to those gender stereotypes. Why do y'all think this is true? Why might research show this to be true? And just, you can flip this based on research. If a man acts too womanly at work, perceived to be less effective. Why does that happen?
I know, just gender stereotypes, I guess.
Why else? Do y'all think this is rampant in the agricultural industry? Why or why not?
I feel like it is because a lot of agricultural instances, I guess, is stereotypical to be a little old school and to not act. If you're a woman, you're supposed to act like a woman, and if you're a man, you're supposed to act like a man.
And so it's this weird conundrum that we kind of get into that, again, research shows us that there's really no difference between genders in task and relationship orientation, right? Just as many women are task oriented as men are. Just as many men are relationship oriented as women are. But in the workplace, if we were to, again, survey workers and have them, they had a male task-oriented boss and they had a female task-oriented boss. Let's just use that as our notion of manly. The woman would in all the studies is always perceived to be less effective, even though her behavior may be the same as her male counterpart. Same thing if this were relationship-oriented. Two relationship-oriented bosses, the male will be perceived as less effective than the female. Why?
Maybe it's the culture of that company or business world.
Yeah, a lot of it's cultural. Again, it's gender stereotypes, but it's also this cultural construction of what it means to be a particular gender. I had a friend that was from England, and when we talk, we were just having these conversations about what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be feminine, And he said he had never struggled with that until he moved to the United States. In the United States, he, and this is again just to be very blunt, this is what this person told me, he's been called gay. Whereas in his culture, the things and the ways that he acts, being into arts and culture and liking to go to shows, that's a very normal masculine activity. But then here, if he starts telling people those are things he enjoys, he gets told he might be homosexual. What? How does that happen just moving across an ocean? Do you think there's any, can you see perhaps maybe why that occurs? Or do you think it's just a random experience that he had? No.
Saying something, JB? Oh, I thought I heard someone else start to say something. I was gonna say, I don't think it's random, I think it happens all the time. And I think it's just a societal difference that we've like kind of cultivated here with our culture. Really, it's just like men are supposed to be tough and, you know, manly, and those of them that aren't here, even if they're not homosexual, we label them as like metrosexual. They're more feminine.
Right.
They're soft. Whereas I see that like in England or like overseas, that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
So.
I kind of feel like that's also taught into us when we're little too. Because I know in kindergarten there are several, you know, like, I think Johnny Appletree is like a man, and he's out cutting down trees, and then you have the lumberjack guy, like you have all of those men that are manly, and then you have the princesses, and it's ingrained in us when we're little.
Yeah. You know, cultural construction doesn't just happen with the things our parents tell us. It doesn't just happen with maybe our faith backgrounds. It's the books we read. It's the movies we watch. All of those different things, right? And it's fascinating if we don't kind of get out of our bubbles. We start to label things unintentionally masculine or feminine, right? So when you hear things talked about like masculine or feminine, people sometimes get really defensive because they really feel like you're attacking a truth that in reality may actually just be a social or cultural construction of what those things mean and which bucket we're putting things into, right? And so, yeah, my friend's experience was really eye-opening to me. And, you know, to be honest, and I've asked my husband if I could share this with y'all. You know, he grew up in a small town, northeast Oklahoma. His family is involved in ag, but he's not. He's in the healthcare industry. And he's had family members say things to him about not really having a masculine job occupation just because he's not in ag like the rest of the people in his family.
Like background.
Really?
That's weird.
And he doesn't, his family hunts and fishes, and he doesn't really care to do that stuff. And I've always asked him why. I mean, I grew up with my dad doing that stuff. And he's like, I don't know. I've never been diagnosed ADD, but I think that's what it is. He's like, every time as a kid as I went, he's like, I could think of 10 other things I could be doing. Like, I will tell y'all, he's not the type that sits still, ever. Like, that is not relaxing to him. And it's, again, you know, you have things growing up that in his hometown, because he wasn't a kid that enjoyed doing those things, he maybe perhaps got certain labels put on him for those. I mean, I think back just to me, even as a kid, sometimes that I'm like, man, I wish I wouldn't have been so stupid or said or thought some of those things, because it happened. It happens based on how we're growing up and the environment we grow up in. But we definitely do have these preconceived notions of what things are feminine, what things are masculine. So, you know, kind of going back to this idea of the labyrinth, if there were some key points I would tell y'all from the reading of this chapter to make sure you understand, is to know what these human capital differences are. And we talk about with it this idea of the pipeline problem. And so if we were to consider, you know, for any job, any organization, in order to move up the pipeline, you've got to be in the pipeline. You've got to be part of the water running through it. And we use this analogy now of the leaky pipeline when it comes to understanding maybe why women aren't getting into some of these higher up positions in an organization. It's not like they don't start out in the pipeline. They're there. But there tends to be holes along the way where women just tend to be leaking out of it. Some of my own research that I've done since I've been here at Oklahoma State is looking at the leaky pipeline in ag education as a whole, all of our disciplines together. How many, in y'all's current like ag ed class, what is like the ratio of males to females, would you say?
We have 18 women and 11 men.
Okay.
We're not women.
I think if I looked to right now in the cohort that's out student teaching, are there males?
There's one.
There's one, right? So that's been that has been a trend in teacher education for about 5 years now, is seeing these cohorts, especially at the undergraduate level, being predominantly female. But then we get to the master's level. What do y'all think happens at the master's level when it comes to ag ed, leadership, and communication? We stay about the same percentage. I would say, if we're going to include everything, about 50-50. Right now in our own department, as far as our master's students, more female than male. What about at the doctorate level? Those who go on to get their PhD. Nationwide, it decreases to about 30% women. And then what do you think assistant professors and faculty members? Even less than that. So like in our Ag Ed Professional Society, AAAE, if we were to include faculty members and graduate students, about 30% are women, but just faculty members is only about 15% of the faculty members in our own profession. And so it's this idea of the leaky pipeline of like, what's happening? Why are less women continuing to pursue and move forward in those areas? And so looking at what's attributing to that, and make sure y'all read about that, because the leaky pipeline is like the big thing that's being studied, not just in ag ed, but also in other professions as well. And like, what can we do to kind of plug up some of those holes so that all individuals remain a part of that pipeline leading up to these high-end leadership positions in different professions? Okay. Make sure you know what are some of the gender differences that research shows there to be. Again, when it comes to task-ed relationship, there really isn't a difference among gender. But what we do know is that women do lead in a more participative or democratic way, and women do feel to be a little bit more adaptable. We also know that there does seem to be this double-edged sword for women, that when they do tend to have, in our culture, what are considered to be masculine traits, they tend to be devalued in their positions. So that's really important to know. We value assertiveness when it's a male leader. We don't value assertiveness when it's a female leader. Okay. And then know, what are some of those gender stereotypes? What are some of those prejudices that affect women? Again, these are just some of the ones that research has shown us exist. Y'all mentioned some of them. We expect men to be confident, assertive, rational, right? But it's okay for a woman to be sensitive, warmth, or nurturer. And when we have leaders of the different sexes that don't fall in line with these stereotypes, we experience cognitive dissonance, which leads us to think they must not be effective in their role. When in reality, that just may be their particular demeanor. It doesn't mean they're not an effective leader. The last kind of analogy I'll give y'all for this, and I bring this up to kind of talk about these stereotypes and being mindful of the words we use and the language we use and the things we say, understanding the things we read and watch and how it constructs our notion of gender. 2 years ago, the toys that were being handed out by Chick-fil-A for kids' meals were cooking utensils. I thought it was awesome. Wilt was 2 at the time, and he was just getting to the point where he was like wanting to help me make cookies at home and do stuff like that. And so, yeah, he got a spatula, he got a cookie cutter, a measuring utensil, like it was awesome. Well, we were at Chick-fil-A before church, and I went to go refill my drink, and a guy came up with his kid's meal, and he's like, can I switch out the toy in the bag? And the person's like, well, what would you like? They're like, well, I have a son, and he got the girl's toy. Didn't realize that these were toys for every kid. Like, they didn't have, how many fast food places do girl and boy toys anymore? Do y'all even know? Like, it's not even, like, I remember as a kid growing up, and like them asking over the drive-through window.
Does McDonald's?
They used to, I remember.
I think the
They
one
do.
that
Still?
back home does, because my mom.
They don't
was-
ask the question anymore,
They don't ask
but they'll
if you
offer
want
two
it.
different toys.
Yeah, they don't ask if you want girl or boy, they just. Sonic doesn't, I don't think, do they?
I don't think
Never
Sonic
heard them
really
ask.
ever has, it's just kind of like a general, there's a box of junk with a.
But I remember the person at Chick-fil-A saying, what do you mean they got the girl's toy? And they're like, yeah, I got the spatula, my boy doesn't need a spatula. And they're like, well, I mean, like, that's all we're giving out this week. And he's like, but I need the boy's toy. Like, the person kept asking, and you could just see the confusion on the person's face at Chick-fil-A, like, And I remember coming back to my husband and being like, this is such a good example of, again, language and the stereotypes and kind of the cultural construction that we have of what is supposed to be feminine and masculine. And who knows, maybe that guy's kid is going to grow up to be like the next, cake boss. I don't know, right? Does anybody think differently of Cake Boss when they watch him on TLC? No, everyone's like, he's awesome. But obviously this person didn't think their kid should be cooking at home. So, any thoughts that y'all have as we kind of wrap up gender and leadership? All right, that went a little bit longer than I expected. Do you feel like y'all are going to be a little bit more conscious of thinking about maybe your own implicit bias when it comes? Maybe the teacher's not mean. How many times have we called, let's just be real, how many times have we called a teacher a, you know what, certain to be? And in reality, she probably acted the same way some of your male teachers have.
Oh, I call all of them that.
I can see that, Jerry.
I get a lot. I did.
But hopefully y'all are going to start to get, you know, this is just going to help in your conversations with other people to say, you know, like research supports this truth when it comes to men and women leading, but research also says, no, this isn't the case. There's really not a difference between how men and women lead. The difference lies in how the followers perceive their leadership. So that's an important thing to know there from the research. Our last class, face-to-face. I appreciate that y'all came to class today. I know we're a few minutes over, so I'll make this quick. Just make sure over the break, there's going to be 2 quizzes that'll be due before Tuesday. Make sure you do those. One of them is over culture and gender. The other one will be over adaptive leadership and systems thinking. I posted those 2 lectures in the module for next week, so y'all can watch them while you're at home. They're about 20 minutes each. I try to keep them kind of short and sweet for you. There's a chapter to read with adaptive leadership, but there's nothing to read with systems thinking. Systems thinking is just its own little lecture by itself. So make sure and do that before we come to class online the Tuesday after. The review for exam 3 has been posted, so y'all can work on that, and that's what we'll focus on Tuesday when we get together. It's just going over what'll be on exam 3 and answering questions y'all have. So have a good Thanksgiving, everybody. Eat lots of turkey.